Chapter 1788. In the smoke, Su Shiqing gritted his teeth and said, "Are you crazy? There's less than 4 minutes left. Dad, I've fulfilled my filial duty to die with you." Yi Liangqiu's voice was calm. Then, she shouted loudly, "Qin Pei. Whether he lives or dies is out of my control. However, I will protect Anlin." She paused for a while and continued, "We have 3 children." Qin Pei whimpered. Yi Liangqiu's heart skipped a beat. She probably knew that he couldn't speak anymore. She quickly squatted down. As expected, there was the sound of bullets flying past. "It's a pity that I didn't kill you." Su Shiqing's voice was strange and creepy. "Liangqiu, if you weren't my daughter but my opponent, it would be fun. It's a pity that you can't even deal with K. You can't even deal with ING Entertainment. Don't you think that you're useless?" Yi Liangqiu fired a shot in the direction of the voice. However, Su Shiqing was cunning and dodged it. Bullets rained down and people were injured from time to time. Xing stuck close to Yi Liangqiu as they moved forward slowly. The smoke had slowly dispersed, and the air had become much clearer. Without the barrier, the frequency of gunshots increased. When everything was clear, there were 30 to 40 people standing behind Su Shiqing. As for Liangqiu, there were only 7 to 8 people. "Liangqiu, you're still too inexperienced." Su Shiqing's voice was cold. "If you apologize to me now, I can let you go." He raised his hand and the people moved forward. Step by step, they forced Yi Liangqiu and Xing into a corner. Yi Liangqiu's voice was low. "Xing, are you afraid of death?" Xing was unafraid of death. "Young mistress isn't afraid." "Of course, Xing isn't afraid. In a while, we just have to hold him back until the end." Yi Liangqiu's voice was calm. It was as bleak as spring. Xing nodded. "All right." Yi Liangqiu estimated that there was not much time left. She, Xing and the rest could hold Su Shiqing back. She couldn't survive. At this last moment, she thought of Anlin. Was he engaged? In the future, there would be a woman to take care of him and a child. She had nothing to worry about. Su Shiqing, the secret, and she would be buried in the sea of fire together. Together, she exploded until not a single strand of hair was left. It didn't matter. Her background was so miserable. Dying like this could be considered a grand and spectacular event. And Anlin was the only beauty in her life. She had no regrets. The red light on the button in Su Shiqing's hand was getting closer and closer, decreasing bit by bit. He was aggressive, but she refused to let go. In the final confrontation, the two of them pointed at each other's head. All of them were cold and emotionless. Su Shiqing's cold voice sounded, "Let me remind you, there are still 2 minutes left. No need. We can die together." Yi Liangqiu raised the gun with her right hand. Blood kept flowing from her left hand. Su Shiqing was a little annoyed. "Do you really want to die together with me?" "Yes." Yi Liangqiu laughed miserably. "You never gave me a chance to live." "Su Shiqing, your retribution is here." Su Shiqing's men wanted to shoot, but once they did, Mr. Su would die too. Yi Liangqiu was trying his best to perish together with him. No one dared to move. The air seemed to have frozen. At this moment, there was a voice at the door. "Let her go." Chapter 1789. The air seemed to freeze. And at this moment, a voice came from the door. "Let her go." Su Shiqing chuckled softly. His laughter was extremely unrestrained. Su Shiqing chuckled softly. His laughter was extremely unrestrained. My little darling Liangqiu, it looks like even the heavens don't want me to die. You want both sides to suffer, but Qin Anlin can't stand by and watch you die. Su Shiqing chuckled lightly. Look who's here. The man who says he doesn't care about you is here to save you. Let's guess, did he bring the transfer agreement from King Entertainment? Yi Liangqiu looked up. Her heart trembled. Qin Anlin stood at the door. He was travel-worn and his face was drained of blood. Her eyes met his, but she couldn't say a word to him. Her lips moved, but she couldn't speak. Little darling, think about it. Is that secret more important, or is King Entertainment more important? If I say it now, even if you survive, how will you have the face to be with him? Su Shiqing laughed happily. Even the heavens were helping him. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips tightly. Qin Anlin, get out. This is a personal grudge between him and me. But she hadn't expected that Su Shiqing wouldn't shoot, but Qin Anlin would. He wasn't shooting at Su Shiqing, but at Yi Liangqiu. The bullet grazed her hand and the gun fell to the ground. She took a step back and looked at Qin Anlin in shock. She knew that he didn't want her to die. But did he know that Su Shiqing could use her to threaten him? Everything had become passive. Qin Anlin would never be so stupid. What he did was really stupid, really stupid. Tears finally formed in her eyes. She moved her lips and said, "Hurry up and leave." Towards the end, her voice was already heart-wrenching. In fact, it was his heart that was being torn. It was also his lungs that were being ruptured. After seeing the people on the wooden dungeon, what else did he not understand? Su Shiqing chuckled. What a big surprise, isn't it, Anlin? You didn't expect it, did you? Your disappointing father is still alive. He reached out and hooked Yi Liangqiu over. Now, what else is there to say? Just like what Liangqiu said, a good hand was easily destroyed by you. Originally, you could have ignored her life and death, let her sacrifice herself, let her die with me, but you fell in love with your enemy's daughter and insisted on saving her. Su Shiqing laughed happily. His hair stood on end as he said coldly, "From now on, you have to listen to me." God, he had never felt so carefree before. The sky was so blue, and the air was so wonderful. Even the ticking of the bombs was so pleasant to hear. He was simply intoxicated. Su Shiqing chuckled and looked at Qin Anlin. Now, give me kind entertainment. Why? Qin Anlin suddenly said, actually, there is another result. Yi Liangqiu looked at him with her heart beating faster. His gaze was gentle. Liangqiu, don't be afraid. He looked at Su Shiqing again. Isn't it just death? At most, the three of us will die together. He raised the gun in his hand and chuckled. She is not afraid, what else do I have to be afraid of? Su Shiqing was stunned for a moment, and then he laughed. Anlin, why do you have to do this? Is it worth it for your enemy's daughter? Chapter 1790. Qin Anlin looked at Su Shiqing quietly. His expression was unbelievably calm, as though he couldn't hear the countdown timer. His voice was low and slow as he said, whether it's worth it or not, that's my business. He paused for a moment and said in a calm tone, I think that if I don't want to, none of us will be able to walk out of here. Su Shiqing was obviously not as calm as he used to be. His cloudy eyes showed that he had lost the upper hand, and he said sternly, How dare you? He muttered, I was actually deceived by you. Qin Anlin interrupted him, and his voice became even calmer. No, I lied to myself. He looked at Yi Liangqiu and smiled. Liangqiu, I'm here. Are you happy? Yi Liangqiu shook her head desperately, and her tears kept falling. Anlin, go away. Don't worry about me. Her voice was almost tearing. I don't need you to care about me. Go back and get engaged. Go. Tears fell uncontrollably, covering her eyes like rain. She couldn't see it, but she could feel that his gaze was gentle, and he kept looking at her. In the most dangerous times, he was very calm. Because he had already decided to use himself in exchange for her safety. In the past and now, everything she did was for him. The truth wasn't that important. Between him and Liangqiu, the most important thing was that she loved him, and he still loved her. They used to be like children, testing each other and hurting each other. But from the beginning to the end, they had left some leeway for their feelings. Yes, they had never given up. She didn't, and he wouldn't either. Qin Anlan's heart had never been so clear before, but on his face, it was calm. All these years, I've never regretted being good to you, or being bad to you. He smiled faintly and looked at her, saying almost cruelly, Yi Liangqiu, I'll give you two choices. The first is that the three of us die together, the second is that you live. Before Yi Liangqiu could answer, Su Shiqing had already said, Qin Anlan, do you think you can decide everything? If you can't, then let's just die together. Su Shiqing paused for a moment but continued to negotiate. Use your life and King Entertainment to exchange for her. Sure. Qin Anlan raised his hand. Bring me the document. Su Shiqing didn't expect it to go so smoothly. He was so excited that he was about to go crazy, he simply couldn't believe it. After being stunned for a moment, he stared at the document. Qin Anlan stood there, pinching the document with his slender fingers. You can check its authenticity. Su Shiqing's voice trembled, let me see. He couldn't believe it. He really couldn't believe it. He was about to reach the pinnacle of his life. Yi Liangqiu shook her head gently. Anlan, don't. It's not worth it. Her voice was mournful. I'm his daughter. I'm not worth it. Qin Anlan's gaze was burning as he looked at her. It was even hotter than when they had their wedding. At this moment, his emotions were so strong that they were about to overflow and he couldn't control himself. But he still had to endure it with all his might, because he wanted his Liangqiu to live. The people beside Su Shiqing went over and handed the document to Su Shiqing. Su Shiqing's fingers were trembling. Finally, he had finally gotten King Entertainment. His lifelong wish. Chapter 1791. He had finally won. He had finally obtained everything. Finally, his life was complete. Suddenly, Su Shiqing laughed maniacally again. Qin Anlan, you're such an affectionate person. He laughed happily. One more minute. He looked up. Do you see that? There's a wooden cell above and Qin Pei is inside. Letting you father and son die together can be considered as having no regrets. He couldn't hide the ecstasy in his heart. His body stiffened and trembled like a candle in the wind, struggling on his deathbed. That look was terrifying. Yi Liangqiu wanted to snatch the document away, but Qin Anlan stopped her. He only said softly, Liangqiu, the three children are waiting for you at home. He had heard Su Shiqing's words just now and could roughly guess that his mother had been unbearable in the past. It was also the truth that Liangqiu had always wanted to hide. This fool. There were tears in his eyes, but they didn't fall. He wouldn't cry easily. He wanted her to always remember that a man who loved her wouldn't cry. He walked forward slowly, his voice low. If you don't let her go, then I promise, Su Shiqing, you'll be turned into a hornet's nest. Su Shiqing laughed sinisterly. At this moment, he had obtained everything. So what if he let Yi Liangqiu live for the time being? Yi Liangqiu looked at Qin Anlan and began to struggle. She looked at him with teary eyes. He was dressed in a formal suit and looked calm as he walked quietly towards the wooden cell. "Anlin!" she screamed. "I don't want you to do this. I don't want you to die. Do you hear me? If you dare to die, I promise I won't live." He didn't stop and continued walking forward. "Do you hear me? I won't live. I won't forgive you." Her face was full of tears. Her body struggled with all her might. The blood in her palms had already dried up. But she couldn't feel the pain anymore. Chin Anlin stood in front of the wooden cell. He slowly turned around and looked at her. His dark eyes were complicated, filled with all the love he had for her. But at this moment, there was only love left. He looked at her and said softly, "Liangqiu, be obedient." "No, I don't want to be obedient." "Anlin, come down." She struggled desperately, crying incoherently. "Anlin, come down, even if we die together, it's better than this. Come down, come down." As he struggled, the blood on his finger dripped down drop by drop. It was a hair-raising sight. His eyes lingered on her. "Liangqiu, I really want to hug you again. I really want to talk to you again. I really want to tell you that I love you." But there was no time, he could only do so much for her. Actually, from the beginning to the end, it wasn't she who owed him, but he who owed her so much. The corners of Chin Anlin's mouth curled up slightly, giving her one last smile. "Liangqiu, listen to me." As she struggled and screamed, he walked into the wooden cell, unlocked it. And in the wooden cell was his father. Chin Anlin's voice was very calm. "Dad, our family of 3 can probably reunite now." Although that person was no longer the person in his memory, he still remembered his aura. He slowly squatted down and reached out to brush his overly long hair aside. Chin Pei instinctively avoided it. How could he face Anlin? "Dad, it's okay. It's all in the past." Chin Anlin's voice was very soft. "Mom will still love you until I die. Nothing in the family has changed. It's still the same after she left." Chapter 1792. Chin Pei couldn't speak and could only sob. Hong Ku, his wife. He couldn't repay the debt he owed her in this life. In the end, he had to watch their only son die with him. "Dad, it's okay. It's okay to lose my life for the woman I like. She and I have 3 children." Chin Anlin's fingers gently touched Chin Pei. At this moment, he didn't have any hatred. Because the heavens had been kind to him. The person he loved would always love him. "Silly Liangqiu, that had nothing to do with you. Why did you take everything on yourself?" She forgot that she was a woman, she forgot that she was also so unfortunate. What did she do wrong? Chin Anlin stood up slowly. "Su Shiqing, let her out. I want to see her out first." Su Shiqing wanted to say something. Chin Anlin's tone was very firm. "I'll count to 3. If you don't let her go, we'll die together." Su Shiqing's mouth opened. Chin Anlin had already counted. 1. Yi Liangqiu shouted hoarsely, "Anlin, I'm not leaving. I don't want to go. I want to be with you. Even if I die, I'll be with you. I don't want to leave you again. I don't want it anymore." His gaze was cold as he counted. 2. 3. Su Shiqing instinctively let go. He didn't want to die yet. The moment he let go, Yi Liangqiu ran towards Chin Anlin with all her might. She didn't care about life or death. She just wanted to be with him. She was wrong. She thought that she was sacrificing herself for him. But in the end, he still wanted her. He still loved her. "Anlin, I won't leave you. I won't be stupid in the future." You're mine, mine alone. I'll never push you away again. She fell to the ground, her palms rubbing the ground. It was covered in blood. He stood in the wooden cell and said sternly, "Kime, drag her out." There were 26 seconds left. He had to let her out. After receiving the order, Kime ran over with reddened eyes, picked up Yi Liangqiu from behind, and dragged her to the door. Su Shiqing didn't stop them. In order for both sides to leave, he would let them leave first before he left. He would deal with Yi Liangqiu after he got out of here. In short, she would not survive. Kime dragged Yi Liangqiu. Yi Liangqiu screamed and struggled with all her might. She opened her mouth and bit Kime's palm until it bled. However, Kime endured it and dragged her out. Their men retreated as well. Kime's eyes were red. The moment he walked out, tears rolled down his cheeks. "Close the door." His voice was steady. Yi Liangqiu let out a heart-wrenching cry, "No." She seemed to have lost her mind. Somehow, she found the strength to break free from Kime and crawled inside. Anlin, he can't die, he can't die." Kime hugged her tightly from behind and said in a deep voice, "I promised Boss Qin that I would keep you alive." And President Qin didn't just do it for her. He did it for old Madam as well. Old Madam had died a tragic death. President Qin would never let Su Shiqing off today. Yi Liangqiu was hugged by the waist. She struggled and hit him, but it was useless. She could only look inside. No. After a high-pitched cry, she fainted from being too agitated. No, Anlin, I don't want this. You can't die. Anlin, you have to live. Su Shiqing naturally wanted to resist. However, there was a row of armed men standing at the door. They lined up in a row and shot at the people inside. Chapter 1793. The people in front of Su Shiqing fell one by one. The document in his hand was also pierced through. The scattered pieces of paper exploded and spread around him. There was also a bloody hole in his mouth. His teeth were bloody and he looked at the door with a hideous expression. They wanted to save Qin Anlin. Dream on. If they didn't let him get what he wanted, then they would all die together. Su Shiqing opened his bloody mouth and laughed sinisterly. His voice was frantic. Qin Anlin. Even so, my daughter still got king entertainment. So in the end, he still won. Qin Anlin's voice was very calm. My son's surname is Qin. Su Shiqing's facial muscles twitched. Then, he smiled strangely. He pressed the button in his hand. No matter what surname, let's die together. Qin Pei, let's fight again in our next life. Hong Ku, I came down with him. Are you still so stupid to choose this useless man? With that press, the entire villa exploded. Flames shot up into the sky. Su Shiqing had his wish fulfilled. He blew himself up into nothingness. Just like the papers in his hand, he fell into a sea of fire. Everything disappeared, including his ambition. And just as the pieces were flying, in the wooden cell, the half-body lying on the ground pressed his son under it. Qin Pei's body, like Su Shiqing's, was blown up beyond recognition. His skin and flesh were split open. However, he had to hug his son. After so many years, he had regretted it. He wanted to go home but he was afraid. No one would forgive him. He had harmed Hong Ku and caused Anlin to have no father at such a young age. He was a sinner. He gasped for his last breath, just to see his wife and son one last time. Hong Ku made his heart ache. Her death made him wish he was dead. He had no reason to live long ago. But he lived greedily, even if he had no legs, even if he couldn't speak. He still remembered that he had a son. He wanted to see him and repent to him. Anlan was no longer the person he had left. He looked so good. He was affectionate, just like his mother. Anlan, that's great. He's grown into what a man should look like. He's not a jerk like him. He had finally waited for this day, but he never thought that the only thing he could do was to use his own body to protect him. After so many years, he could finally hug him. She hugged her son. Anlan. Anlan. If you can live, can you forgive Dad? Even if I do not deserve to be forgiven, but cannot forgive. If you forgive me and survive, only then will I have the face to see your mother. Only then will I have the face to atone for my sins, and only then will I have the face to take care of her. But he was also worried that Anlan's mother would hate him in his current state. Her bloody fingers trembled as she stroked Chin Anlan's face and hugged him tightly. Son, don't move. Don't move. Daddy is here to protect you. Don't move. As long as there's a glimmer of hope, you have to hold on. You have 3 children and Liangqiu waiting for you. She's very nice and loves you very much, just like how your mother used to love me. Anlan, live well, live well. Chin Pei's life was over. Chapter 1794. He couldn't say another word to his beloved son, but his body expressed all his fatherly love. Anlan, this can't make up for anything, but Dad wants you to live on. A drop of hot tears dripped from the corner of the person's eyes and instantly evaporated. He endured the burning pain and the tightness of his skin all over his body. His body felt like it was about to split. He felt like he was splitting into many people. He couldn't even tell how many injuries he had suffered, and he couldn't tell if he was still alive. He only knew that he was being hugged tightly. He smelled a familiar scent. He closed his eyes, as if he had returned to his childhood. Anlan, are you happy? Dad, I'm happy. Raise it a little higher. It's very high. Isn't Anlan afraid? A little higher. Dad, raise it higher. He slowly crawled down and curled his body up with all his might. It was his father. Tears kept flowing from the corner of his eyes. The man whom he hated and loved was also dead. But at this moment, he didn't hate him anymore. He thought that, in the end, that man had always loved him. He let out a roar from his throat. He wanted to live, Dad, I want to live. Inside the villa, more than 10 people in protective suits rushed in with water guns. They rushed to the side of the wooden cage and opened it. The surrounding fire was extinguished. A charred body was lying on the ground. The flesh on the body was almost burnt, and some bones could be seen. However, he was hugging the person under him tightly. His palms were black and in the shape of a tent, protecting him. They flipped him over, carefully lifted the person underneath, and quickly walked out of the fire. Outside the villa, a slender figure stood tall and straight. He looked at the person being carried out and said lightly, "Send him to the hospital immediately." Kaim came over and said gratefully, "Mr. Du, thank you." Du Yueshing looked down. "Don't tell Mr. Yi yet. I'm afraid she won't be able to take it. Besides, Chin Anlan probably doesn't want her to know." Kaim hesitated for a moment but still nodded. "Yes." Du Yueshing's eyes were clear. He looked at the fire and said lightly, "Let's go. It won't be safe here soon." When he got into the car, he leaned against the back seat and recalled the phone call he had received earlier. It was a call from Chin Anlan. He actually knew all along that she liked Yi Liangqiu. This phone call was a deal. It was Chin Anlan's final arrangement for Yi Liangqiu. It was also his selfless love for her. He said that if anything were to happen to him, he, Du Yueshing, would take care of Yi Liangqiu. As for King Entertainment, it would all depend on his mood. Such a good thing was what all men wanted, but he was angry at that time. But in the end, he still agreed. Because he really liked Yi Liangqiu. It wasn't to the point of being unscrupulous, but he liked it very much. He liked her so much that he didn't want to give up when the opportunity presented itself. Du Yuexing closed her eyes and dialed a number. If it can't be treated at home, send it directly to the United States. When he opened his eyes again, his gaze was heavy. He thought that he should go and see Yi Liangqiu. By the time Yi Liangqiu woke up in the hospital, it was already 2 days later. She opened her eyes abruptly and lifted the quilt as if it was a reflex. Her mind was in a blur, but she knew that she had to look for it now. What was she looking for? Anlin. Anlin, just as she fell to the ground, her body went limp and she fell to the ground. The drip on her hand fell off and blood stained the hospital gown. Chapter 1795. An elegant voice rang out, "You're awake." He gestured to the nurse beside him to help her up, but Yi Liangqiu refused. She struggled frantically, calling out Qin Anlin's name. At this moment, she had already remembered everything. She remembered the sound of an explosion in her ears. She had fainted, but she could still hear it. "Anlin, I want to see Anlin." She struggled with all her strength, but it was in vain. She was extremely weak, but even so, she was still throwing a tantrum. Tears slid down the corner of her eyes, forming a watery glint. Du Yuexing finally got up and gestured to the nurse with his eyes. The nurse released her hand, and Yi Liangqiu fell into his arms. She refused and struggled with all her might, but how could she resist him with her strength? With just a little bit of strength, he was able to trap her entire body. The man, who had always been stern, said in a low voice in her ear, "He's not here anymore. Calm down." Although it was cruel, he said it easily. She would throw a tantrum, but not saying it would be even more cruel to her. Yi Liangqiu was stunned. Not here anymore. What did he mean? She stared intently at Du Yuexing, searching his face and his eyes for something, as though she was looking for an answer. "What are you talking about?" Her voice was very soft. "Can you tell me where Anlin is? Where is he? Is he also in the hospital? Is he injured?" Her expression was careful, as though she didn't dare to speak too loudly. If she did, the last dream in her heart would be shattered. That kind of her made his heart break. And her weakness, her pain, were all because of someone else. Du Yuexing was still a person who cared too much about relationships. When necessary, he could be very ruthless. Since he wanted her and wanted to be with her for a long time, then nothing else mattered. His voice was a little sorrowful. "Qin Anlin, he's dead." "Dead? Dead? How could he be dead?" No, he must be lying to her, right? Anlin was an omnipotent and intelligent person. He wouldn't die for her. He definitely had a way to escape. He was the kind of person who would only do things if he had a foolproof plan. He wasn't an impulsive person. How could he die? She covered her head, refusing to accept such an answer. She desperately said, "No, no, he won't die. You're lying to me. Go away, go away. I want Anlin, go away." She bit her lip so hard that it bled. Blood flowed down from the corner of her mouth, and it was dark red. Du Yuexing sighed, "Liangqiu, my condolences." She didn't need to grieve. What does she mourn for? Her Anlin was not dead. She did not need him. She wanted to find Anlin right now, right now. He frantically pushed Du Yuexing away and stumbled outside. After taking 2 steps, his legs gave way and he collapsed. He crawled up and ran again. Just like that, he stumbled out. By the time he reached the door, he was already extremely weak. The young nurse said worriedly, "Mr. Du, do you think we should use Valium?" "No." Du Yuesheng refused without thinking, "She's pregnant. I'll follow her. Don't go over." As he spoke, he followed behind Yi Liangqiu and watched as she ran forward with all her might, calling out Qin Anlan's name with all her might. She pushed open the doors of the wards and searched them one by one, calling out to him. "Anlan, come out. You're inside, aren't you? You must still be angry, right? That's why you deliberately got someone to tell me that you're not around. I don't believe it. I won't be fooled." Chapter 1796. They must have been lying to her. Anlan would not die. He definitely would not die. Yi Liangqiu searched desperately. She pushed open the doors of the wards one by one. Those messy faces were not her Anlan. She lifted the quilt of those people. She was called a lunatic, but she did not care at all. Dragging her remaining body, her palms bled again. The blood dripped onto the hospital floor drop by drop, until she felt hopeless. At the end of the hospital corridor, the sunlight could not penetrate the glass, leaving only a faint afterglow. Yi Liangqiu squatted by the wall. She held her head with her hands and buried her face deep in her knees. At this moment, she was not the strong Yi Liangqiu, the queen of music, or even the mother of 3 children. She was Yi Liangqiu who had lost her lover. Everything seemed to have returned to the past, to the time when she had nothing. Her body used to be so tough, but at this moment, it was so fragile. She cried hoarsely, venting the pain in her heart. Her cries became louder and louder, becoming heart-wrenching. "Anlan." She closed her eyes and called his name. A flock of white pigeons flew up in the square of the hospital. The pigeons were startled and flew up to the sky, blocking the sunlight in the long corridor. The light was getting dimmer and heavier. She squatted there alone. It was as if she was the only one left in the world, and in the ward where she was squatting, a body was lying quietly. His body was full of tubes. He was lying there, his whole body was tied up like a plaster cast. He could not move at all. His eyes were tightly shut. Only a pair of eyes could be seen on his face. They kept trembling, but he could not open them at all. His consciousness was distant, and his body was like fragments, piecing together piece by piece. He heard someone crying. Whose voice was that? Was it Liangqiu? Was it his Liangqiu? Was he dead or alive? Why could he still hear Liangqiu crying? He wanted to get up and hug her. But he did not even have the strength to blink, let alone stand up. He had regained some of his consciousness, but that also meant that the pain had intensified. Excruciating pain. Her cries could no longer be heard. He tried hard to ignore his own pain and feel her pain. However, the pain was so intense that he could not resist at all. He could only follow his consciousness and rise and fall, rise and fall. His fingers drooped down again, returning to calmness. He fell asleep, in pain. When would be the next time he woke up? Would he still be able to hear her voice at that time? He fell asleep. Only when he was asleep did he feel less pain. Outside the door, a slender figure slowly approached her. He stood beside her and said in a low voice, "Liangqiu, I'll take you back to the ward." She didn't cry anymore. She just rested her pointy face on her knees and looked forward, not moving an inch. Suddenly, she looked up. Anlan. When she saw the person's face clearly, her face palpitated with a deep sense of disappointment. It was not Anlan, but Du Yuesheng. She didn't move. Instead, she buried her face even deeper. She didn't want to talk to him. She didn't want to see anyone. At that moment, she just wanted to be alone quietly. She didn't want to hear any bad news. Go away. Her voice was hoarse. Her face was full of tear stains. Some were dry, some were not. Chapter 1797. Du Yueshing stood there, his voice a little hoarse. Do you really love him that much? She was silent. He asked again, do you really love him that much? This time, Yi Liangqiu looked up at him. It's none of your business. Her face had a look of alienation and resistance. She didn't want him by her side, because she could vaguely feel that this man was taking care of her. His appearance was related to Anlin. She instinctively resisted. However, Du Yueshing bent down and carried her in his arms. His voice was a little tense. Don't you want to find him? I'll take you there. She struggled but to no avail. He hugged her tightly and strode towards the opposite building. When he pushed open a door, it was filled with a freezing aura. Yi Liangqiu began to panic. She struggled with all her might, scratching Du Yueshing's face and neck. He also let her grab him, holding her body in place and using his body temperature to warm her. When they came to a door, several medical staff were guarding it, all of them wearing masks. Du Yueshing nodded at them, then opened the door and led them in. Yi Liangqiu's body began to tremble, and so did her lips. They were curled up. It was unknown if it was because of fear or the cold. Du Yueshing hugged her tightly and said in a low voice, Don't you want to see him? He's inside. She trembled, unable to say a word. Her teeth were clenched, and her face was pale. In front of her was the morgue. The aura that assaulted her was cold and gloomy, as if it came from another world. Ignoring her resistance, Du Yueshing nodded at someone as if he wanted her to give up. The person was wearing a thick protective suit and opened a large drawer. Yi Liangqiu stared blankly for a few seconds, struggling desperately. She let out a shrill cry, No, it's not Anlin. It's not. She stared at it for a few seconds, her face as white as a sheet, and vomited uncontrollably. She vomited on Du Yueshing. The medical staff was shocked. Mr. Du Yueshing stopped him. It's fine. He carried her out slowly and waited for her to finish vomiting. He patted her back and wiped the stains off the corner of her mouth. Yi Liangqiu was lying in the corridor of the hospital, her fingers on the windowsill. She stared blankly at the vast expanse in front of her, as if she couldn't see anything. Her eyes were burning. She could still remember that there was a man's ring on the hand of the burnt body. It was their wedding ring. He was still wearing it. Yi Liangqiu's fingers clung to the window frame, and her body swayed. But she still struggled to stand up. He stood up slowly and walked forward step by step. Du Yueshing followed behind and tried to help her up, but was waved away by her. Mr. Du, we met by chance, you don't have to be so nice to me. Her voice was cold without much emotion. However, she stumbled as she walked. She held on to the wall and walked forward step by step. She didn't need anyone else. If Enlon wasn't around, she would be fine alone. She used to think that death would be easy, but now, it was very difficult. Du Yueshing watched her slowly leave from behind. He somewhat understood why Qin Anlin liked her so much. He originally treated her as a substitute, but now, he seemed to like her a little. Chapter 1798. Yi Liangqiu was sick. Qin Anlin's funeral was handled by Kaim and Du Yueshing. It was done in a low-key manner. But no matter how low-key it was, there were still people who came to cause trouble. The atmosphere in the Qin family's old residence was cold. Yi Liangqiu was dressed in plain clothes. She looked at the Shen family's parents and Shen Ruo. As for why they were here, she thought she knew. Aunt Sue arranged for Miss Shen's family to offer incense. Yi Liangqiu supported her sickly face. Her face was pale and sickly. Aunt Su suffered a huge blow. When the old lady died, she didn't come back to her senses. But when the young master was gone, she woke up. Now, the young master left behind 3 children, and Liangqiu was their mother. No matter what, when the young master was gone, the young master and young miss were the Qin family's hope. Protecting Liangqiu meant protecting the children's status. Everyone else was an outsider. Only Su Xiao had been in the Qin family for decades. Her words carried some weight. She said word by word, "Invite Miss Shen to offer incense." Shen Ruo didn't move. The Shen family's mother said sharply, "Su Xiao, you might have said something wrong. Why can't you tell who's more important now? Our Shen Ruo is the young mistress of the Qin family. It's not her place to speak in the Qin family, don't you think so?" Su Xiao indifferently lit the incense and bowed to the old lady's portrait 3 times. Then, she turned back and said slowly, "Liangqiu is the mother of the Qin family's heir. Why can't she speak? Our Shen Ruo is Anlan's fiancée. She is more qualified to inherit the Qin family's inheritance." The Shen family's mother snorted. "Did you forget the engagement banquet not long ago?" Su Xiao's expression was very cold. She had the demeanor of a big family. "Mrs. Shen, you know that she is unmarried. If she is not married, how can she be legally valid?" The Shen family's mother was stumped. She looked a little embarrassed, but she was still unwilling. "Then what about this bitch? Why is she standing here? She caused Anlan's death." Crispy Sleeve was still unmoved like a mountain, because she is loved by young master and liked by old madam when she gave birth. Shen Ruo's mother gritted her teeth. Shen Ruo is pregnant with Qin Anlan's child. Everyone present jumped in fright. Although the young master loved Liangqiu, he was angry at that time and Shen Ruo was his fiancée. It was not impossible for him to do something out of line. Hence, Qingxiu was stunned. Because if it was the young master's flesh and blood, she wouldn't dare to say that she would abort it, but in the end, he was still a scourge. This child was just a tool to fight for the family property. Just when she didn't know what to do, Yi Liangqiu, who was kneeling, said softly, "Since Miss Shen is pregnant, please stay in the Qin family. When the child is born, we will do a paternity test. Then, Miss Shen's innocence will be clear." Shen Ruo was stunned. What hope was there? So he hardened his voice, "Why should I listen to you?" Yi Liangqiu, who was kneeling with her back facing Shen Ruo, slowly got up. She came back to her senses and looked at Shen Ruo quietly. "Because I own 50% of King Entertainment's shares. Is that enough?" Shen Ruo was stunned. How was that possible? "Yi Liangqiu, I don't believe it. I won't believe it even if I die." Shen Ruo recalled that day when Qin Anlan left. Had he made up his mind then? Just because of Qingxiu's words, he believed Yi Liangqiu and gave King Entertainment to her. When he left, he decided to sacrifice himself for Yi Liangqiu. Then what was she? Chapter 1799. Even if Shen Ruo didn't believe it, it had become a reality. Keim took out the document and announced, before President Qin left, he transferred all the shares to Yi Liangqiu. He added, "As for this ancestral home, I think Miss Shen should be very clear about what it means to the Qin family." Of course Shen Ruo knew. She was so angry that her whole body was trembling. How could Qin Anlan treat her like this? He had always treated Yi Liangqiu as his wife, but he was engaged to her. As it turned out, she was nothing. President Qin gave Miss Shen a villa as compensation. The lawyer will discuss the details with Miss Shen later. Keim's voice was calm. He didn't say that it was Yi Liangqiu's intention. President Qin left so suddenly that he could only make arrangements for Mr. Yi. How could he take care of Shenruo? Shenruo shook her head and sneered, how can the child in my stomach be worth only a villa? Yi Liangqiu sighed, Shenruo, do you love Anlin? Shenruo was stunned. Of course I do. So, don't make things difficult for someone who has already left. Yi Liangqiu said quietly, okay. Shenruo was completely stunned. She wanted to deny it and say that she didn't do it for money. But if it wasn't for money, then what was it for? She couldn't stand her ground. Shenruo, even if you have this child, King Entertainment will not belong to you. Moreover, there is no child. Yi Liangqiu said calmly and didn't care about them anymore. She knelt down and said, let him leave in peace. Shenruo's parents and Shenruo stood there. They wanted to cause trouble but couldn't. In the end, they flipped through the documents before giving up. There was nothing more to say. It was useless even if Shenruo was pregnant. The child in her stomach wasn't Yi Liangqiu's. When Shenruo left, she gritted her teeth and looked at Qin Anlin's photo. Is it worth it? No one answered her. From the beginning to the end, it was just a beautiful dream that she had. That was all. Finally, he left. It was quiet. When only Crispy Xiu and Yi Liangqiu were left, Crispy Xiu's voice was hoarse. Young madam, I'm sorry for the past 2 years. Yi Liangqiu turned her head and looked at her. In just a few days, Su Xiu's hair had turned completely white and she had aged a lot. The corner of her mouth twitched. Aunt Su, I'm sorry. She thought that she could perish together with Su Shiqing, but in the end, she indirectly let Anlin leave. Su Xiu bitterly said, young madam, Aunt Su is not an unreasonable person. I have wronged you. She didn't want to bring up those things. In any case, she trusted young madam. If young madam didn't love Anlin, she wouldn't have given all the shares of ATV to young master. Young master had left, but that was because he loved young madam. How could she have the heart to scold him when they were in love with each other? Yi Liangqiu looked at Crispy Xiu and her lips trembled slightly. In the end, she hugged her. Aunt Su, I'm very sad. I don't know why Anlin and I ended up like this. Her face was stuck to Crispy Xiu's shoulder. I hate that I am Su Shiqing's daughter. I hate my birth. I would rather have my surname Yi. How could Crispy Xiu not know her pain? Because at this moment, Liangqiu's pain was her pain. They could only hug each other for warmth. Liangqiu, I know. Aunt Su knows. Crispy Xiu comforted her, her voice filled with sorrow. Yi Liangqiu closed her eyes. But, I still feel that he is alive and hasn't left. Chapter 1800. Su Xiu's sorrow was no less than Yi Liangqiu's. She had been in the Qin family her whole life and was half a member of the Qin family. Old Madam and Anlin had both left. Her heart was empty and she had lost her pillar of support. But Liangqiu was back and there were still 3 young masters and young mistresses. That was how Su Xiu could live on. Yi Liangqiu's fingers held Su Xiu's thin palm and she said softly, Aunt Su, promise to Anlin and Mom that you won't leave me. Su Xiu was stunned. Aunt Su, can you promise? Yi Liangqiu's face rested on her shoulder. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I left you with nothing. I made you lose everything. But I still selfishly ask you to take care of the children. Su Xiu's hair was white and her tears flowed freely. Liangqiu, this silly child. She was worried that she wouldn't be able to live on, that was why she said that. Su Xiu nodded. Aunt Su will watch. I will always stay with the Qin family. Aunt Su still has to watch young master and young mistress get married. Yi Liangqiu hugged her gently. Don't leave me either. Su Xiu cried and nodded non-stop. Qin Anlin was buried on a drizzling morning at the Qin family cemetery. And Qin Pei was able to go home and be buried with Lady Qin. This was Yi Liangqiu's wish. Su Xiu also knew that old madam had never forgotten this heartless person, so she agreed. In the drizzle, they stood for a long time with the children. The smoke and drizzle washed away the last trace of her vulnerability. She couldn't be weak anymore. King Entertainment was waiting for her and the child in her stomach. On that last night, she wanted to get pregnant and had his child as she wished. Now, this child was more than a month old and had already taken shape. Her appetite wasn't good. Coupled with morning sickness, her figure was even thinner. She was 172, but she had lost less than 50 kilograms. Yi Liangqiu took Su Xiu and the children and moved back to the villa where she and Qin Anlin had lived after their marriage. After a week of rest, she went to work at King Entertainment. She took over King Entertainment and classified ATV as a subsidiary of King Entertainment. Du Yuexing had also helped a lot in secret. She knew this, but she didn't say it out loud. If this man wanted to take care of her, she would refuse. And Lan wasn't here, and no one could replace him. Even if it was his wish, she wasn't willing. King Entertainment was on the right track. She was in charge in B City, while the outside world was handled by Kaim. Kaim became a flyer. And flew all over the world almost every week. He would sometimes complain, but it was only a small talk. Yi Liangqiu promoted him to vice president, which was a well-deserved title. Yi Xiao Yi Liangqiu Yi Xiu Xiu and Yi Xiu Yi Wang Xiuzi Yi. Kaim took a cup of milk and placed it on the table. He took a cup of coffee and smiled. Mr. Yi, what are you talking about? Yi Liangqiu turned around and put her hand on her abdomen. She smiled. I said, if only Anlin was here. Kaim was sad. A strange look flashed through his eyes, but it didn't escape Yi Liangqiu's eyes. She just smiled without batting an eyelid. Kaim, look at that large piece of land. In the future, it will be built into a park. It will be very beautiful from here. Kaim smiled. President Qin will like to plant a maple tree. Because maple trees would turn red in autumn, and Mr. Ye's name had the meaning of autumn. President Qin would definitely like it. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. Okay. Chapter 1801. Kaim's heart skipped a beat and he asked, Mr. Yi, what are you talking about? Nothing. Yi Liangqiu smiled and turned around. She held on to her 4-month-old belly as she slowly walked over to the sofa. Kaim hurried over to help her sit down as if he was serving the Empress Dowager. Mr. Yi, be careful. This little one is very naughty. Yi Liangqiu smiled. The doctor said yesterday that it's twins again. Kaim was stunned. 2 more. Then the Qin family would have 5. I'm asking for Tang Yu's psychological shadow. He has clearly done that many times. Why does he only have a small heart? Yi Liangqiu's fingers gently stroked her belly. This morning, I felt the baby move. Kaim took a sip of coffee and made a mental note of it. Yi Liangqiu sipped her milk and looked at Kaim. Have you been to see Qingqing recently? Kaim nodded. I have. I used my connections to meet her. He had already made the connections there. Now, he would bring He Huan over every year. When Su Qing came out, she would look normal. She would put on makeup and dress like a little princess, just like in the past. She would always feel embarrassed and say that she was different. Actually, he felt that she was fine. The clothes did not suit her because her eyes were less willful and more gentle. He thought that it was time to change her style. They would spend about 2 days together. They would be like a normal couple. But when they parted, it would be a little sad. At first, Su Cheng was a little uneasy. She was always afraid that he would regret it and that he would not be able to wait any longer. He never promised that he would just pick her up on time next time. He was also careful not to let her get pregnant again. He had He Huan. It was already his sin to let her give birth to He Huan in prison. How could he bear to do that? 10 years. Only 10 years. They would see each other 10 times. Then, they would be together forever. When Yi Liangqiu saw the smile on Kaim's face, she knew that he must be satisfied. She whispered, "I never thought that you and Qing Qing would end up together." Kaim couldn't help but think of Qin Anlin. His brows loosened a little, and there was a strange look on his face. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and finished the milk. "Well, you should go back early. You just came back from the US yesterday, right?" Kaim nodded. "The branch company there has also stabilized, so you don't have to work so hard in the future." Yi Liangqiu's tone was indifferent as she looked at Kaim. However, Kaim didn't suspect anything. He smiled faintly. "It's fine. Recently, the domestic capital market has been sluggish. I'm still very optimistic about the overseas market in the mainland." Yi Liangqiu nodded. "I trust your judgment, but you can't be too busy. Take good care of He Huan." Kaim nodded. "I will." When they were about done talking, Yi Liangqiu slowly got up. "I'll be going for a prenatal checkup later. You should go back and rest early." Linda was still accompanying her. After sending Kaim off, Linda turned around and whispered, "Mr. Yi, do you think there's something wrong with Vice President He?" Yi Liangqiu shook her head. "No, I've never doubted Kaim's loyalty to the company." Linda was a little confused. She didn't doubt it, but she saw that CEO Yi was very interested in Kaim. Kaim didn't feel it herself, but she had been watching over him and could see it clearly. Linda didn't dare to ask further. She picked up Yi Liangqiu's coat and said softly, "Mr. Yi, it's windy outside. You should wear more clothes when you go out." Yi Liangqiu looked out the window and sighed. It's early autumn again. Chapter 1802. She stood in front of the French window and looked at it for a while before putting on her clothes. Linda accompanied her. When they went downstairs, they were surprised to see Su Qingxiu. "Aunt Su, why are you here?" Linda carefully helped Yi Liangqiu into the car and said casually. Su Qingxiu and Linda got into the car together. She glanced at Yi Liangqiu and said to Linda, "I'm always worried. I'm also panicking at home, so I came after thinking about it." Yi Liangqiu smiled and patted her hand. "Aunt Su must think that Moo is too clingy." Both Su Qingxiu and Linda laughed, especially Su Qingxiu. After laughing for a while, she sighed. "This child grows up so fast. I don't know how long he can stick to me in the future, or maybe I don't have many years to live." "Nonsense." Yi Liangqiu was slightly unhappy. "Aunt Su will definitely live long enough to see Mu Yun get married." Su Qingsang's words made Su Qingsang happy. That little guy in Mr. Tang's house seems to be very afraid of the young master. Yi Liangqiu also smiled and reached out to touch her lower abdomen. After a long time, she said softly, "Maybe Mu Yun has his own plans." She actually knew something, but now that Anlin was not around, Mu Yun was worried about her and his younger siblings, so he did not take action. This child's thoughts were really deep. Su Qingsang nodded in agreement. Mu Yun was indeed very precocious. As they spoke, they soon arrived at Xingyuan Hospital. It was still Dr. May who took a look at the children. The children were very good. They were 4 months old, and they were all boys, Qin Anlin's strong genes. After finishing the ultrasound, Yi Liangqiu slowly sat up. Dr. May's gaze moved from the screen to her face and she smiled. They are 2 strong little guys. Yi Liangqiu made a sound of acknowledgement. She waited for the ultrasound results to come out. She stared at the little black dot on the image and was a little entranced. Dr. May also accompanied her. Ever since Anlin's accident, everyone took good care of Liangqiu, afraid that she would take things too hard. After all, when Anlin had just left, Liangqiu had a hard time. When she went out, Dr. May supported her. Dr. May had actually reached the age of retirement, but for the sake of Liangqiu's child, she deliberately delayed her retirement. When the 2 children came out safely, she could be considered to have completed her mission. Yi Liangqiu walked out with her. Su Xiao and Linda were waiting outside. When they saw Dr. May, they immediately asked, "How is it?" "Both adults and children are fine, but Liangqiu is too thin." Dr. May held Yi Liangqiu's shoulders with both hands and smiled gently. "Su Xiao, make more delicious tonics later." When she heard that the children were fine, Su Xiao's eyes narrowed and she couldn't close her mouth. "Of course. I will definitely take care of the mother and children until they are fair and chubby." As she said that, she felt a little heartache. "Thank you for your hard work, Liangqiu. These days, there aren't many girls who are willing to have 5 children." Yi Liangqiu's heart also felt like it was fucking a dog. She said it like a pig. She coughed lightly. Both times were accidents. "I had no choice but to get pregnant with 2. However, she was very clear in her heart. How did the 2 children in her belly come about? That night, she deliberately seduced him, and that was how she got these 2 children. At that time, she thought that if she was alive, these children would be her salvation, but she didn't expect that the one who got into trouble was Anlin. Chapter 1803. As if they could sense her emotions, the 2 children moved at the same time and kicked her hand. Anyway, it was tough. Su Xiao thought about it. In a while, Aunt Sue will personally buy fresh pig trotters and cook them with soybeans. It's the best for collagen and it can also produce milk in the future. Linda giggled. Yi Liangqiu had no choice. "Aunt Sue, isn't it a little too early?" "How can it be early? We have to prepare early." Su Xiao's heart was filled with the plump boy and Liangqiu. She could also fatten up a little so that she would be able to give birth. A woman who was too thin would also suffer a great loss of vitality when giving birth. As she said that, Yi Liangqiu looked at Dr. May with some bitterness. Dr. May smiled. Seeing them like this, she felt relieved and watched them leave together. Yi Liangqiu and Su Xiao walked to the door of the elevator and unexpectedly met a familiar face. Shenruo. And it was the genuinely pregnant Shenruo. Although her stomach hadn't protruded, the man beside Shenruo was carefully supporting her. With one look, they could tell that she was pregnant. Then when she was engaged to Anlin, she was pregnant with someone else's child. What a big heart. At this moment, Su Xiao's face was also livid. In her heart, she had guessed a little, this woman was really shameless. When young master was around, she dared to make young master a father. When young master wasn't around, she dared to use the bastard child in her stomach to ask for the Qin family's property. She was really shameless. Shenruo also didn't expect to meet Yi Liangqiu and Su Xiao, this fierce old woman. This old woman had never liked her. It was in the past and it was still the same now. Now that they met, it was a small world for enemies. Su Xiao's gaze fell on the man beside Shenruo. He was a four-eyed frog, weak and small. he didn't have much meat on his body. With one look, it was obvious that Shinruo had him. Thinking about it, a man who couldn't keep an eye on his own woman. She was clearly pregnant, but she still blamed it on another man. Thinking about it, he felt weak and useless. Liangqiu could forget about it, but Crispy Sleeve felt that she had to say something. This was too outrageous. Miss Shen, what a coincidence. There was shrewdness in Su Xiu's eyes. You have a boyfriend so soon. Are you here for a premarital checkup? Shinruo's face was a little pale. She didn't know if it was because of her pregnancy or because of the man beside her. She nodded and didn't say much. She couldn't tell that she actually cared about this man. However, no matter how much he cared, he was just a spare tire. If he cared, he wouldn't have clung on to young master like that. Crisp Sleeve continued, however, you have our young master's child in your tummy, so you should take care of yourself. Shinruo's face became even paler. She gritted her teeth and said, what nonsense are you talking about? The man beside her was already looking at her in bewilderment. She wouldn't care because she was pregnant. If he didn't marry her, it would be hard for her to find a good man in the future. Crisp Sleeve laughed coldly, weren't you and your parents the one who made a scene at the Qin family, saying that you were pregnant with young master's child? Crisp Sleeve said something that stabbed her heart again, you should know clearly whose child it is, right? Of course I know whose child it is. Shinruo blurted out. After saying it, she regretted it. She said in a very low voice, Qin Anlin didn't touch me. Chapter 1804. As soon as Shinruo finished speaking, Soft Sleeve sneered. So she hadn't slept with him before. How shameless of her to say that she was pregnant with young master's child. Young madam shouldn't have given that villa to her. But it wasn't impossible to take it back now. She could sue Shinruo. But Yi Liangqiu stopped Soft Sleeve with her eyes and said to Shinruo lightly, I also believe in Miss Shen's innocence. Also, I wish Miss Shen good luck in finding a suitable marriage partner. Shinruo didn't expect her to be so magnanimous. The man beside her had a complicated expression on his face. He was a university professor who had liked Shinruo for many years, but Shinruo had rejected him. A month before her engagement, they had sex once. Shinruo was drunk, and so was he. That was why they had rolled around together. Then, there was no then until she got engaged and Qin Anlin passed away. She found him and said that she was pregnant. It was his child. He didn't ask further. He felt that if she said it was his, then it was his. But he had never thought that she had used this child. If the Qin family had acknowledged this child, would she still have returned to his side? The man was a little hesitant and unhappy, but he didn't show it. He only said lightly, it's time for us to check. Shinruo grunted softly and left with the man. And when she left, her face suddenly turned pale. Because she just realized that Yi Liangqiu's belly was big. She was also 4 months pregnant, but Yi Liangqiu's belly was unusually big. Thinking about it, Qin Anlin had decided to get engaged to her, but at night, he hugged his ex-wife and rolled around in bed. It was ironic. Shinruo finally didn't want to stay. She took a deep breath and walked into the obstetrics department. Beside her was the child's father. She should be satisfied. But deep in her heart, she couldn't lie to herself. She only liked Qin Anlin. But he didn't want her. Outside, Soft Sleeve snorted. Luckily, young master didn't marry her. How shameless. Yi Liangqiu looked at Soft Sleeve and sighed. I hope that Anlin will marry her one day. When Crispy Sleeve heard this, her heart ached. Liangqiu had never been able to let go. Her lips moved. She wanted to comfort him, but she didn't know what to say. Because Qingxiu herself was also grieving. They were just giving each other warmth. Yi Liangqiu's gaze landed on Crispy Sleeve's face and she smiled lightly. However, there will never be such a day. If Anlin was still alive, he could only marry her. Crispy Sleeve heaved a sigh of relief and helped Yi Liangqiu to the car downstairs. After getting in the car, seeing that she was in a good mood, Xu Xiu also felt relieved. The car stopped at the supermarket for a while, and Xu Xiu personally bought all the ingredients, preparing to make a good meal at night. Linda also went there for a meal. After dinner, Yi Liangqiu took a walk in the courtyard of the villa. She had this habit, and it was also for the smooth delivery. Mu Yun accompanied her, his big hand holding her small hand. It was a little cold at night, so she pulled Mu Yun's little body into her arms to keep warm. Maybe it was because the little guy was almost 10 years old, so he was a little shy. His little face was a little red and hot, but he still obediently stayed in his mother's arms. Yi Liangqiu looked up at the bright moon in the night sky and sighed. Mu Yun, do you miss Daddy? Mu Yun's body tensed up. He didn't say anything and just hugged her tightly. Chapter 1805. Mu Yun looked up. Really? Of course, Yi Liangqiu stroked her son's head and said gently, but Mu Yun has to keep it a secret. Momo and Mumu were still young, so they didn't understand these things, but Mu Yun was sensitive. Although he didn't say it, Yi Liangqiu knew that he was very sad. She hugged Mu Yun again and said softly, "It'll be the Mid-Autumn Festival in a few days." "But, Anlin, where is he?" Mu Yun hugged her with his little hands. "Daddy will definitely come back." She nodded and hugged her son tightly. Soft Sleeve stood under a big tree. She was going to ask Liangqiu to have supper, but she didn't expect to hear this conversation. 2 lines of tears flowed down from the corners of Soft Sleeve's eyes, and her entire body was trembling. She knelt down under the tree, put her palms together, and mumbled, "Old lady, if you know in the afterlife, you must send young master back safely." These days, she could clearly see that young madam had been working too hard. After losing Anlin, she had to work hard to support such a big company, and she was pregnant. Even if Dr. May didn't say it, she could tell that Liangqiu had lost a lot of weight. However, no matter how she thought about it, she did not think that Anlan could possibly be alive. "That's great, that's great. Old lady, that's great." Soft Sleeve's tears kept flowing, and under the moonlight, they looked very bright. However, she also heard what young madam said. She couldn't tell anyone, or else it wouldn't work. She was an old lady after all, and her brain wasn't working well enough to believe all this. When Yi Liangqiu and Mu Yun left, she glanced at the dark. She knew that Soft Sleeve's pain was no less than hers. Soft Sleeve had been with old madam since she was 10 years old. She watched old madam give birth to Anlin and watched Anlin grow up. The Qin family was Su Xiu's root, so Anlin's departure was a huge blow to Su Xiu. Now, she was almost certain that the person buried in the Qin family cemetery was not Anlin. She'd done a DNA test. No one knew she'd done that. And why did she say that this person was Anlin? She thought that the only possibility was that Anlin was still alive. In the past, she had suspected that Du Yuexing was plotting something, but after more than 2 months, that person had remained well-behaved. He was well-mannered and never went overboard. Then she knew there must be another reason. He had no other choice. She did not ask for anything in her heart. All she wanted was for Anlin to return to her side safely. Nothing else mattered to her. Seeing the mother and son return to the villa, Qingxiu knelt down in the direction of the old lady and mumbled something. After he returned, he was busy burning incense and praying to the heavens. Yi Liangqiu saw how crazy he was, but she didn't stop him, Soft Sleeve's health wasn't good to begin with. Now that he had something to do and something to think about, he felt a lot better. Days passed. They spent the Mid-Autumn Festival together. In November, the weather cooled down. Kym got someone to plant a maple forest on the piece of land she bought. At the end of November, the leaves of the maple trees were all red. From afar, it looked like a burning flame. It was beautiful and spectacular. Yi Liangqiu could see the patch of red from the office. Her belly was bulging. She was 6 months old, and the 2 little guys had already filled up her belly. Chapter 1806. Kym, do you think Anlin will like that maple forest if he's still around? She held her stomach as she stood there. Her body wasn't as nimble as before, but her cheeks had gained some flesh due to Su Xiu's desperate nourishment. It looked fine and white, but it was still pretty. Kym stood next to her and followed her gaze. She saw the maple leaf that was like fire. After a moment, he said mildly, "Yes, he will definitely like it." Yi Liangqiu grunted and turned around. "How are the preparations for tomorrow's trip to America?" Kym smiled. "I fly there often, so everything is there. I didn't prepare much." Yi Liangqiu nodded. "That's true. You'll be gone for a month this time. Don't you miss Huan Huan?" She sounded like she was complaining. She felt that he was too cruel to the child. Kym smiled bitterly. "I have no choice. But the nanny at home is very good. It saves me a lot of trouble. No matter how good it is, it can't compare to the company of a father." Yi Liangqiu looked at him. "You should reduce the work there in the future. Let someone else do it for you for a month." She paused. "The company's recently promoted mid-level executives are quite capable. You should let go and give more time to He Huan." Kym was familiar with her. He smiled. "I'm trying my best to improve the company's performance." In these 2 months, not only him, but even Yi Liangqiu had been working very hard. The merger with ATV wasn't that simple. There were too many interests involved. Fortunately, they had all been resolved. Now, he could finally heave a sigh of relief. So he had to go to America more often. After all, Kym snapped out of his thoughts and stopped thinking about it. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. "I will give you 5% of my shares." Kym refused. "No, Mr. Yi. You only have 50%. That won't do." Even when President Qin was around, there was no such rule. But Yi Liangqiu was determined. "Based on everything you've done for the Qin family and King Entertainment, Anlin is here. This 5% is what you deserve." She paused. Although ATV has merged with Kym Entertainment, it is still an independent entity. I plan to leave it to you to manage in the future. Kym, don't let me down. She said this not only because of Kym's ability, but also because it was Anlin's wish. Kym said softly, "We'll talk about this in the future. Right now, I want to develop the branch company in America well. In the next 1 or 2 years, whether King Entertainment can successfully integrate into the global market will depend on the situation there." Yi Liangqiu looked at him for a while and smiled. "Of course." Kym looked back at her and felt that she was a little mysterious. Did Liangqiu know something? That's not possible. He had been very discreet. It was impossible for her to find out. Moreover, President Qin had made arrangements for his funeral. Why would she suspect him? He must be thinking too much. But just to be safe, Kym still had to be careful. 3 days later, America. After Kym finished his work, he drove to a private nursing home in the suburbs. It was located in a very elegant environment and was very well hidden. Ordinary people couldn't get in. The car drove through the main entrance and drove for about 5 minutes before stopping in front of a small 3-story building. It had white walls and red tiles. The building was exquisite and quiet. Kym went to the second floor and pushed open a heavy wooden door. Then he passed through a glass door and entered the sterile room. Chapter 1807. In the clean ward, a man wrapped tightly in gauze lay quietly. If it weren't for the slow rise and fall of his Huaxia accent, one would have thought that he was dead. Kym changed into a dust-free suit and walked over. With a gentle swipe of his palm on the metal panel, the glass door slowly slid open. He walked over to the bed. All he could see were cold instruments and lifeless tubes. The man on the bed breathed weakly and then received oxygen. However, he was awake. Only a pair of eyes could be seen. Through the fog mirror, he opened his eyes slightly and looked at Kym. His lips moved, but he couldn't say a word. Kym made a shushing gesture and bent down to whisper a few words into the man's ear. The man's eyes opened slightly. His pupils seemed to be dilated. Although most of his face was blocked from his eyes, it could be seen that he was smiling. He was smiling happily, even though it took all his strength to do so. Even if he lived through today, he didn't know if he would have a tomorrow. At this moment, he was already very happy because she was alive and well and they had 2 children. His children. He had never dared to imagine that Liangqiu would be pregnant. It was clearly just one night of indulgence. There were so many things he wanted to ask Kym about her and his 3 children. However, he couldn't speak. He could listen, but only when he was awake. Most of the time, he was unconscious. He tried not to sleep because once he fell asleep, there was a possibility that he would never wake up again. Every day, when he opened his eyes, he hoped that Kym would appear and tell him about her. If he knew that she was sad, he would be sad. If he knew that she was fine, he would be fine too. However, Kym still didn't talk about her and Du Yuexing. He thought that it was fortunate that he couldn't speak, otherwise he would ask. He hoped that she could find someone to rely on, but that was what he was most afraid of. He looked directly at Kym. Kym was stunned for a moment before she smiled slightly and whispered in his ear, "The doctor said that his life will not be in danger after a few more days." For the past 2 months, he had been on the edge of life and death. No one knew how long Qin Anlin could live. And he didn't want Liangqiu to know what he looked like. Suffering once was enough. He didn't want Liangqiu to suffer twice. After hearing Kym's words, the person lying on the bed remained expressionless. What did life and death matter to him? It was better to die than to live like this. However, he was still a little greedy. As long as he was alive, he could at least look at her from afar. Kym's gaze fell on his face. Suddenly, he heard the alarm go off and his gaze froze. Someone came in. As for the person on the bed, his gaze loosened. Was it her? Was she here? Kym bent down and whispered, "I'll go out for a while." As he spoke, he turned around and slowly walked out. At the door, he placed his palm on the piece of metal. The door closed, and the piece of glass slid past a white wall. It looked like a passageway, and it was impossible to tell that there was another paradise inside. Kym pursed her lips, walked to the elevator on the other side, and quickly disappeared. A moment later, a slender figure appeared in another direction, but her abdomen was slightly bulging. She walked over slowly and walked to the place where Kym had been. She had been there for a long time. There was nothing here except for the smooth walls and the faint smell of disinfectant. Chapter 1808. She closed her eyes. Although she couldn't see anything, "Anlin, I know you're here. You're right here. I can smell your scent. No one can replace it. Why don't you want to see me? I know you're living with great difficulty. I'll wait, and so will the child. She stood there for a long time. Kaim came out of the elevator. When he saw her, he looked surprised. Mr. Yi. Why are you here? Mr. Yi. Yi Liangqiu looked indifferent. Kaim hadn't called her Mr. Yi for a long time, but he hadn't noticed. That was probably what it looked like to be nervous when lying. Yi Liangqiu looked at him and said slowly, I came to America for some business. I heard you were here, so I came to see you. Kaim nodded. An old friend is here. I just finished visiting him. At this moment, his expression was normal, and there was no change in his emotions. Yi Liangqiu stared at him for a long time before she smiled faintly. That's good. How is he now? Kaim paused and said, he's fine. That's good. Yi Liangqiu sounded even more indifferent. Let me know if you need any help. Kaim nodded. Of course. After saying that, he felt Mr. Ye's gaze on his face for a long time, which made Kaim's hair stand on end. After a long time, Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. I'm leaving. Kaim immediately followed her and coughed. I'll see you off, Mr. Yi. Yi Liangqiu paused. I'll stay in America for a week. Kaim was startled. Mu Yun was the eldest son of the Qin family and would inherit the Qin family's business in the future. It was obvious what it meant to send him to the Tang family. Furthermore, the 10-year-old Yi Muyun could see that his future was limitless. Momo was still young, and he didn't know if the two in his stomach were round or flat. Wasn't it a little too rash to make such a decision now? Son, did he just send his own son to Tangyu? Wouldn't Tangyu die from laughter? His little heart was smart and cute, but it was a long story. Boyi had businesses all over the world. If Mu Yun went to the Tang family, it meant that he would have to carry Boyi on his shoulders in the future. After all, he wasn't Seiji's biological son, so he probably had to work several times harder. Kaim's heart ached at the thought of this. He wanted to say something, but he didn't have the right to do so. He opened his mouth for a long time, but didn't say a single word. However, the news that Mr. Yi told him at this time still shocked him. Even though they had a good relationship, he was still an outsider. Kaim's heart skipped a beat. He thought about how Mr. Yi had followed him here. It was obvious that he suspected the truth. The incident with Mu Yun was probably orchestrated by Mr. Yi. As for his motive, Kaim did not dare to continue thinking about it. And he didn't dare tell President Qin about this. Kaim felt like he was stuck in the middle, like a biscuit. It was very difficult. Yi Liangqiu smiled. This is Mu Yun's own idea. Besides, she lowered her head. There are too many children at home. I can't take care of Mu Yun, so I just let him do what he wants. Kaim was still in a state of shock. Wasn't this a little too casual? This was his son, not a cat or dog. The driver had already opened the car door for Yi Liangqiu. Before she got in, she looked at the 3-story building again. Kaim, continue with your work. I can go back by myself. Chapter 1809. What else could Kaim say? It was obvious that Mr. Yi was suspicious of him. He was afraid that it wasn't as simple as that, but he couldn't understand why Mr. Yi didn't forcefully dig 3 feet into the ground. If she wanted to, she could have done it. After sending her off, he stood in the same spot and took a puff of a cigarette. This matter was really difficult for him to handle. After a long time, he received a call from Mr. Yi. Mr. Ye's voice was calm as he said, Kaim, you're quite busy. Why don't you bring He Huan over to America? It'll be convenient for her to stay with Mu Yun. The muscles on Keim's face twitched. After a long time, he said in a low voice, "Thank you, Mr. Yi, but there's no need for that." He was being blatantly threatened. Mr. Yi knew far more than he had imagined. But what could he do now? He was lying there, unwilling to see her. He exhaled again and said in despair, "There's a situation. There's a situation with my friend. I'll tell Mr. Yi as soon as possible." Yi Liangqiu grunted indifferently, seeming to be satisfied. After the call ended, Keim stubbed out his cigarette and said, "What's the big deal?" He walked slowly into the 3-story building and went to the ward. The person lying there was already asleep. Keim stared at him for a long time before he said, "Go to sleep. It won't hurt if you're asleep." He sat down. It was only then that he dared to touch him lightly. He asked him softly if it hurt. But no one could answer him. Qin Anlin lay there, lying there quietly, not making a sound. It had only been half an hour since they had last spoken, but Keim felt like a century had passed. "She came. She knows you're still alive. But I didn't let her see you. I was afraid she wouldn't be able to take it." Keim smiled bitterly. "She's pregnant. It's not like she didn't guess it. She knows you're still alive. You must be in pain." This kind of news was salvation for her. However, it was too cruel to look at him in such a miserable state. Keim didn't want her to see it, but she didn't insist. Perhaps she already knew that she was doing this because she didn't want to disturb him. "Live on. I believe that no matter what she becomes, she will still love you." Keim smiled bitterly. "Live on." The eyebrows of the person lying on the bed loosened, but his eyes were still closed, living in a dream. Only in dreams, there was no struggle, no pain. Only in his dreams, she was still his wife, and he did not need to think about what he had become. He did not need to think about whether he was too ugly standing next to her. The interior of the expensive black limousine was filled with tissues. Yi Liangqiu sat in the back seat and kept pressing her nose. Linda said cautiously, "Mr. Yi, what's wrong?" Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips. "No, I'm happy. I'm very happy." "Oh," Linda replied. She still didn't understand. Yi Liangqiu rolled down the car window and looked at the trees passing by the roadside. She couldn't calm down for a long time. Even though she had suspected it before, she couldn't be sure. But now, she was sure. Anlin was still alive. Actually, she only wanted him to be alive. That was good enough. The sound of the explosion still lingered in her mind, and she couldn't get rid of it. She had never dared to think that Anlin could still be alive. But now, he was really alive. Even if they didn't meet, it was good enough to know that he was alive. Chapter 1810. Just like Keim, Liangqiu ran between B City and New York. She didn't ask to see Qin Anlin directly because she knew that he wouldn't want to see her. She didn't mind, but he would. Sometimes, a man's self-esteem reached a breaking point that you couldn't cross. Keim wouldn't tell her everything, but she was satisfied knowing that he was alive. As long as he was alive, she would accompany him. In another way, she would accompany him. The maple leaves in B City became redder, but she still didn't see him. Keim's news was always vague. And she waited anxiously. When winter came, she couldn't take it anymore. Ignoring her 8-month-old belly, she went to America. There were no maple leaves in America. There was only the smell of disinfectant. However, when she came to the private hospital, he was no longer there. Keim said that he had left, and he didn't know where he had gone. But he was so weak. Where could he go? Yi Liangqiu's limbs were weak. She didn't know where to find him. A person whose identity didn't exist naturally couldn't be found in ordinary ways. Don't worry, Mr. Yi. President Qin will take care of himself. Keim's voice was a little hoarse. His body is fine now. Yi Liangqiu held her stomach as she stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window of the New York apartment. This was Anlan's apartment. He didn't come back here. Where would he go? Keim, can he go back to be city alone? She said softly. Other than a private plane, he can't go back by himself, can he? Keim looked at her. So Mr. Yi wants to wait for him here. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips. I want to give birth in New York. She reached out and rubbed her stomach. I think Anlan must want to see them too. Keim was silent for a long time. Liangqiu, don't wait for him. He won't come back. Don't tell me how ugly he has become. She was still standing there, facing the light, a faint halo floating around her, and because she was pregnant, it looked like she was covered in a layer of holy light. She continued, Keim, don't tell anyone about this. He doesn't want me to know, and he definitely doesn't want anyone else to know. I don't want him to get hurt. She slowly turned her head. If one day he comes looking for you, please think of a way to bring him home. King Entertainment was in B City, and most of the children were also in B City. Anlan's roots were in B City, and she wanted to bring him home. What she couldn't do, she could only let Keim do it. Anlan could protect her with his life, and she could endure it for him. After saying that, she turned her head again. Think of a way to let him live a better life. As she said this, she felt a lump in her throat. In the past, Qin Anlan lived a life of luxury. But now, he ran away alone. What kind of life was he living outside? She didn't know. She was worried that he couldn't take care of himself. She did not even dare to look for him recklessly. She was afraid that he would run away. She had a premonition that he would appear when she gave birth. Keim nodded. Don't worry, I will. He looked at her stomach worriedly. Because she was pregnant with 2 children, her stomach was especially big. 8 months was like a full term. All the prenatal checkups were done in B City. He felt that it was inappropriate to do it in New York now. However, Yi Liangqiu had already made up her mind. I'll bring Qingxiu and the children to New York for the time being. Her voice became softer. After I give birth, if I can't wait for him, I'll go back to B City. Chapter 1811. Keim sighed in his heart. She didn't dare to force Qin Anlan either. This kind of love was too careful, too humble. Since she had made up her mind, Keim went to make the arrangements. 3 days later, Soft Sleeve, Momo, and Mumu arrived in New York and moved into Qin Anlan's apartment. On the first night in New York, Keim also had a sumptuous meal in the apartment. Soft Sleeve made a table full of good food, but her expression was still a little uneasy. She looked around eagerly. Yi Liangqiu knew what she was looking forward to, so she only smiled faintly. Aunt Sue, this dish is the best. Eat more. Soft Sleeve looked at her. This child, you don't eat more when you're pregnant, but you still want me to eat more. I'm afraid of getting fat. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly, but she still tried her best to eat more. Although Soft Sleeve didn't see Qin Anlan, she saw that Liangqiu was in a good mood, so she felt more at ease. Young master should be alive. However, Liangqiu was still thin. Where had she been eating? She didn't seem to be gaining weight. After Keim finished eating, he didn't leave immediately. When Yi Liangqiu returned to the study, he accompanied Soft Sleeve to the kitchen to clean up. Soft Sleeve was usually afraid of provoking Liangqiu, but she dared to ask Keim anything at this moment. As she washed the dishes, the old woman nagged, Shuheng, don't hide everything from me. Kime smiled bitterly. Aunt Sue, how would I dare to hide anything from you? Soft Sleeve glanced at him and lowered her head to wash the dishes again. She snorted lightly. I just want to know if young master is alive. Kime sighed. Aunt Sue, don't make things difficult for me. Even though he said that, he still felt sorry for the old woman. Looking at Aunt Sue, she had aged a lot in the past 6 months. Her hair was white and her spirit wasn't as good as before. Soft Sleeve threw down the rag and said in a strong voice, You little bastard, I used to give you so much food for nothing. Kime was helpless. Aunt Sue used to be a quiet person, but now that she was making a scene, she was even worse than his mother. She was at a loss and didn't know what to do. She wiped away her tears, and her voice softened. However, it was still very miserable. I've been in the Qin clan for so many years, and I've never asked for anything else. As long as Anlin is still alive, I'd rather go to the underworld to accompany the old madam. Kime said repeatedly, Auntie Sue, why do you have to do this? In the end, she couldn't bear to do it. She thought to herself that it was Mr. Yi who revealed it, which was why Crispy Sleeve was so persistent. In a low voice he said, I can only say that I'm alive. As for his whereabouts, I don't know, and neither does Mr. Yi. He sighed, Aunt Sue, Boss Yi doesn't want to force it. You too, don't force Boss Qin to the point where he doesn't even have a place to stay. When Crispy Sleeve recalled the fire and the sound of the explosion, her heart trembled. She wasn't stupid. It was impossible for a person to be alive after such a huge fire without any injuries. Young master hid for so long and didn't appear. His injuries must be very serious. Just thinking about it made Crispy Sleeve's heart clench and ache. Anlin has never suffered, Crispy Sleeve said in a low voice and wiped away her tears. Crisp Sleeve said in a low voice, wiping away her tears. But with his ability, he'll definitely have something to eat. Kime laughed. This Aunt Sue's self-healing ability was too good. He secretly heaved a sigh of relief. It seemed like everyone knew. He thought he had hidden it so well. Chapter 1812. Just as he was thinking about it, Su Xiu's expression changed. After wiping away her tears with her apron, she said mysteriously, Shuheng, Auntie Sue fried bananas for you. They're delicious. And I heard that whatever you eat will nourish you. What was going on? Kime was speechless. Besides, Su Cheng was still in prison. If he nourished her, where would he put his energy? Hence, he raised his hand. No need. Thank you, Auntie Sue. It's getting late, I'll leave first. Auntie Sue had already pierced a banana. She held it in her hand. It's delicious. Auntie Sue, eat it yourself. Kime coughed lightly. You'll need it. Su Xiu watched him leave and shook her head. I don't like to eat this. Do I still need it? She repeated it again. The more she listened, the more she felt that something was wrong. Then, she shouted, This bastard. Meanwhile, Kime had already walked out, feeling a little more relaxed. When he reached downstairs, he opened the car door and sat in the car. Just as he was about to start the car, he was stunned. Because there was a man sitting in the driver's seat. A familiar yet unfamiliar man. The man was dressed in black, wearing a black shirt and black pants. The hoodie covered his face, revealing only his side profile. Was it President Qin? That side profile was still as perfect as before. Kime heaved a sigh of relief. President Qin. Qin Anlin looked at him. In the dark car, he didn't take off his hat. He just lit a cigarette and said slowly, I need $1 million. Do you have it now? His voice was extremely hoarse. It was obvious that his vocal cords had been injured. It was a little uncomfortable to listen to. Chaim was already a high-ranking official. Transferring $1 million was just a small amount. He wanted this amount because he didn't want to alarm Liangqiu. Chaim looked at him and nodded after a while. President Qin, Auntie Sue, and Liangqiu are all upstairs. Qin Anlin held a cigarette in one hand and smiled faintly. I know. Chaim wanted to ask more, but Qin Anlin took off the hat on his head. At the same time, there was a flash of light in the car. It was the high beams of the car in front. This also allowed Chaim to see the other side of Qin Anlin. He took a deep breath, his fingers trembling. Half of the body and the neck are all like this. Qin Anlin's tone was very calm, like a pool of stagnant water without any ripples. Chaim was still in shock and didn't say anything. Yes or no? Qin Anlin seemed to be a little impatient. He put on his hat again and asked lightly. Chaim finally snapped back to reality and said in a hoarse voice, she won't care. Yes, she doesn't care, but I do. Qin Anlin's voice was very calm, without a trace of anger, but with a vague sharpness. She doesn't care, but she will be afraid. He smiled coldly, and because of the darkness, he seemed a little creepy and scary. Have you ever thought that she wouldn't dare to turn on the lights when she was in bed with me? Because if she did, she probably wouldn't be interested in these scars anymore. Chaim's voice trembled slightly. She won't. She will. Qin Anlin's voice was firm. Chaim, do you dare to look at my injuries? If you can look at them, then she won't be afraid or disgusted. As he said that, he tore off his clothes. It was full of injuries. Those injuries were ones that Chaim didn't dare look at. Looking at them would make his hands and feet cold, and he would tremble uncontrollably. You'll be afraid too, won't you? Qin Anlin said in a low voice. Don't say that she won't be afraid. Any woman would be disgusted by it, let alone doing the most intimate thing. There was even no place for skin grafting. This injury was destined to follow him for the rest of his life. Chapter 18:13. When Qin Anlin tore off his shirt, Chaim was stunned. He had never seen it before. Qin Anlin had never let him see it either. In the dark space, Qin Anlin's hoarse voice rang out, Now, can you still say that she's not afraid and that she won't despise you? After a long time, Chaim said with difficulty, Skin grafts can be done. Especially on her face. The corners of Qin Anlin's lips curled up slightly. From the side that was intact, it looked the same as before. Do you see the skin on it? It can be done on the face, but not on the body. Was he going to have to turn on the lights and wear his clothes every time they made love in the future? He had no illusions. Sometimes, a husband and wife were separated by a piece of paper, fragile and pale. Chaim watched as he buttoned up his shirt. After a while, Qin Anlin pinched a cigarette between his fingers and took a puff. Faintly, he asked, 1 million. Do you have it? Chaim's gaze was straight and his voice was filled with helplessness. Yes. This was an easy thing for him to do, and he could do it in a way that would not make it obvious. Qin Anlin patted his shoulder, took another puff, and put it out. I'll wait for you here at the same time tomorrow. Chaim watched in a daze as he got out of the car and quickly disappeared into the night. He looked at the extra pack of cigarettes on the dashboard and took it. It was a normal pack of cigarettes that cost about $1. It was very cheap. In the past, President Qin would never have smoked such cigarettes, but Chaim closed his eyes, feeling conflicted. After a long time, he laughed bitterly, lit a cigarette, and took a deep puff. Leaning back in the seat, he looked at the moon in the sky and started the car with one hand. The next night, at the same time, he drove over. When the car stopped, he sat down and smoked a cigarette. The night was like a curtain, and the stars in the sky sparkled. Kym could see that he was a little lost in thought. In the dark, a figure quickly opened the car door and got into the car, sitting next to him. Kym tilted his head and looked at the person, feeling very conflicted. He didn't think it was good. He thought it was unfair to President Chin. Losing King Entertainment was one thing, but did he have to lose his wife and child as well? Kym's voice was a little depressed. President Chin, here's $1,000,000 yuan. Actually, you can. You don't have it. Chin Anlin took the bag from his hand. It was cash. He pulled it open to take a look, then closed it again with a calm expression. Take good care of them for me. Just as he was about to open the car door, Kym's voice rang out. Are you really going to push her to someone else? Chin Anlin's hand stopped, and his body was tense. He seemed to hesitate for a moment before he said self-deprecatingly, What do you think I can give her in my current state? Apart from not being able to give her a complete married life, can I go out with her like this? Kym, I can't. I'll live a life that's neither human nor ghost. I'll be like a monster that haunts the night. He paused for a moment and repeated, yes, like a monster, unable to do anything, appearing and disappearing in the dark. Kym's mood was terrible. She won't mind. I said I mind. Chin Anlin's voice was calm. Since I can't give her anything, I might as well let go. Kym's eyes were a little hot. Can you do it? I don't believe you can. Chapter 1814. Chin Anlin's voice was full of mockery. Even if I can't do it, I have to. Kym, you and Su Ching are different. With that, he opened the door and got out of the car. Kym cursed inwardly as he leaned back heavily. Suddenly, she heard a woman's voice. Anlin. The voice was hurried and there was a hint of panting. It was Liangqiu. Kym was shocked. She couldn't care less and immediately opened the door to get out. It was indeed Liangqiu. She held her 8-month-old belly and stood in the night wind. Her long hair fluttered in the fierce night, revealing her slightly pale complexion. On the other side stood Chin Anlin. He was still dressed in black and his back was facing her. Anlin, is that you? She held her belly and walked over slowly. She didn't dare to walk fast or speak loudly, for fear that she would scare him away. Chin Anlin's body was stiff and his voice was hoarse. You've got the wrong person. He carried the bag in his hand and walked forward, his footsteps getting faster and faster. Yi Liangqiu's voice sounded heart-wrenching in the dark night. Anlin, I know it's you. Won't you look at me? He didn't stop, and she ran forward desperately. However, she was pregnant with 2 children and it was already 8 months. She couldn't run anymore after running 2 steps, and there was a violent fetal movement in her belly. She let out a hiss and bent over with her hand on her belly. She looked a little pained. Anlin, my stomach hurts. She bit her lip and said with a tone of forbearance. Chin Anlin's footsteps paused. In the darkness, he slowly turned around. She looked up at him. He was against the light, so she couldn't see his face. She could only see a pair of deep eyes that were glowing. She was sure that it was Anlin. It was him. He was back. Her expression was filled with longing. She held her stomach and walked towards him with difficulty, 1 step at a time. Every step she took was painful. It was so painful that she almost fainted, but she still endured it. Anlin, I know you're in more pain than I am. If you're in pain and don't want to walk over, I can go over. You just stand there, and this time, I'll go over. The night breeze blew her long hair and lifted it, revealing her face. He stood there, his body frozen, his eyes staring at her greedily. It had been too long since he had looked at her like this. She was still the same as before, just thinner. Although she was pregnant, her hands and feet were delicate, his eyes were a little hot, and a layer of mist floated over them. His fingers were also quietly clenched into fists. "Don't come over. I am afraid I frighten you, madam." His voice was hoarse, and had lost its former elegance. But she still stubbornly walked towards him step by step. Kaim's heart trembled as she felt sorry for her. He watched. There was still a distance of 4 to 5 meters between them, but she still wanted to move forward. However, Chin Anlin pulled his hat and lowered his voice. "You've mistaken me for someone else. I have a wife." After saying that, he walked hurriedly and quickly disappeared around the corner. Actually, she could have stopped him, but she didn't. She just stood there. The moonlight was like water, and it also reflected the tears on her face. Kaim walked forward carefully and reached out to support her. His voice was gentle. "Mr. Yi, do you need to go to the hospital?" Her agitation had disturbed the fetus. Yi Liangqiu placed most of her weight on Kaim. She turned her face. "Kaim, you're good." Chapter 18:15. Kaim's heart trembled and he sighed. "Don't tell me he's not Anlin." Yi Liangqiu broke free from him and turned to walk towards the apartment. Kaim was worried and immediately followed her. He apologized carefully. "Mr. Yi, you have to understand me too." He meowed cautiously. That's weird. Isn't Mr. Ye's stomach hurting anymore?" "She's running like she's flying. She doesn't look like a pregnant woman." He really wanted to pinch his stomach to see if it was real or not. But he didn't have the guts. "Understand what?" Yi Liangqiu looked at Kaim and sneered. "Oh yeah, you must be satisfied seeing Ching Ching once a year. Why don't we change it to once every 2 years? Wouldn't that make it easier for you to understand how I feel?" Kaim's heart felt like it had been stabbed. His face turned bitter. "Mr. Yi, do you have the heart to do that? Tell me his address." She looked at him. Kaim continued to smile bitterly. "I really don't know." "Then let's do it once every 3 years. She didn't hold back. Kaim quickly said, "I'll try my best to find out." As soon as he said that, Yi Liangqiu grabbed him tightly and said in a pained voice, "Take me to the hospital." Kaim was terrified. Wasn't he fine? Why did he have to go to the hospital? "Hurry up, my stomach hurts." Yi Liangqiu frowned and pinched Kaim's hand deeply. Kaim was shocked. He immediately picked her up, got out of the elevator, and walked towards his car. His steps were hurried, but they were steady. He carried her carefully and opened the back door to help her in. Then, he quickly got into the car and drove towards the hospital. In the darkness, a black figure walked out, looking in the direction of the car. He was still holding the bag of US dollars, but his hand was clenched. He was worried, but he didn't feel good either. Because Kaim was holding Liangqiu. Kaim looked very nervous, and he hugged her as if he was worried about his wife. At that moment, he felt a little upset in his heart, but more than that, he was worried. After watching for a moment, his body quickly disappeared into the night. He flagged down a taxi and followed the car in front. Late at night, at a private hospital in New York. After the examination, Yi Liangqiu's fetus was affected, and there was no problem. She just needed to stay in the hospital for 2 days for observation. Kaim was so busy that he was sweating profusely. After settling down, he called Qingxiu and Linda to explain the situation. It was always inconvenient for Kaim to take care of women. In the end, he decided to go back to pick up Aunt Sue, and he and Linda would take care of the children together. Crisp Xiao was scared out of her wits and kept asking why this had happened. Kaim didn't know how to explain it, so he decided to go back first. I'm fine. You can go back now. Remember to bring everything. Yi Liangqiu calmed down. It was good that Kaim agreed to her request. She also believed that the reason why he agreed wasn't for her and Su Qing. In fact, he knew very well that she wouldn't do that. Kaim made some more arrangements before driving back to pick up Crisp Xiao. After a night of fooling around, it was almost 11 o'clock. Although her stomach hurt, she was a little tired from lying down. She closed her eyes and slept a little hazily, but it didn't feel comfortable. Because when she closed her eyes, that pair of eyes would appear in her mind. She believed that it was Anlin. Chapter 18:16. She placed her palm on her lower abdomen and stroked it gently. Her voice was low and gentle. Baby, Mommy has found Daddy. He's still here. Her abdomen wriggled again and again. She cried and laughed at the same time. She pressed her tear-stained eyes and face against the pillow. It was cold and then warm again. Mommy has found Daddy. Her voice was soft like a little girl as she whispered, no matter what Daddy has become, Mommy still likes him. Do you think Daddy still likes Mommy? She smiled faintly, filled with happiness. In her palms, there were two children moving around happily. Tears flowed down from the corners of her eyes and down her nose. She sniffled, looking a little embarrassed and disappointing. However, she was happy, she wanted to cry, and she wanted to laugh. She saw him. She saw her Anlin. He was alive. He did not lose a hand or a leg. He was alive and well. She closed her eyes and the corners of her mouth curled up slightly. Outside the door, the hospital corridor was too cold and cheerless. A dark figure stood at the door of the ward for a long time. Separated by a door, separated by a wall, was his wife and his child. He longed to see her, but he was afraid that she would be scared when she saw his face. He was afraid to see fear on her face, and he was afraid of her disgust. He forced himself to leave her and return her life to her. In any case, there was no one named Qin Anlin in this world. He stood there, lost in his emotions for a moment. He did not notice a young nurse coming over, the light shone on one side of his face. The nurse walked closer and saw clearly. With a scream, the medicine tray in the young nurse's hands fell to the ground. It's too scary, too scary. The young nurse was shocked and covered her face with her hands. However, she was a nurse after all. She calmed down quickly. This should be a burn patient. The blonde nurse asked in fluent English, Sir, why aren't you in your own ward? I'll go back immediately. Qin Anlin lowered his voice. The wounds on his face and neck did not make the nurse suspect anything. It was not until he walked away that she remembered that he was not wearing a hospital gown. He was not a patient of the hospital. After the surprise, the nurse didn't ask any more questions. She changed her clothes, pushed the door open, and helped Yi Liangqiu check her condition and feed her medicine. I heard a noise outside just now. Yi Liangqiu's voice was calm. The nurse smiled and comforted him. It's just a dermatology patient. A patient from the dermatology department. Yi Liangqiu immediately asked, what kind of patient is he? She hesitated and asked, how is his face? The nurse thought for a moment. Half of the face is fine, but the other half is ruined. Even skin grafting is difficult because the skin on the face is uneven. After at least 5 or 6 surgeries, the results are not ideal. She paused for a moment before continuing, there are also severe burns in his neck. It should be a full-body burn. Yi Liangqiu clenched her fists in the quilt, but there was a faint smile on her face. I see. Yes, it's a little scary. The young nurse smiled faintly. But God will bless and treat everyone fairly. Yi Liangqiu did not speak, but she thought to herself, your God can't protect Anlin. The nurse helped her adjust the quilt and went out, leaving a dim yellow light behind. Chapter 18-17. It must be him. It must be him outside. He said it ruthlessly, but he couldn't let go of her. Her heart ached for him. She should have guessed that he was injured and his appearance had changed, but she didn't expect it to be so serious. Then she could understand why he avoided her, and didn't want her. Qin Anlin, you fool. Just because of this, you don't want me. You don't want the child. She pursed her lips tightly and lay on the bed, crying silently. She was not a fragile person. Knowing that he was alive and seeing him alive, she shed more tears than when she thought he was dead. There was a kind of tears called tears of joy. She knew that he was in pain and that he was feeling inferior, but she was selfish. No matter how much pain he was in, she still wanted him to live. She wanted to soothe his pain. She wanted to soothe the bruises on his body inch by inch, to comfort him with all her heart. Tell him it wasn't ugly, tell him she wasn't afraid at all. But she did not dare to disturb him. She was terribly afraid that he would go away, terribly afraid that he would never appear again. She even regretted giving Kaim the chance to give him money, but she was also afraid that without money, he would have a hard life. His heart was conflicted. He was always too tired, so he fell asleep just like that. When Aunt Sue arrived, it was almost 12 o'clock. The old lady's health was not good and Kaim felt a little guilty. However, it was not suitable for him and Linda to take care of a pregnant woman. After apologizing, Qingxiu was anxious. I'm still healthy. When he got out of the car, his steps were a little hurried, and Kaim hurriedly helped him up. No one knew what Qingxiu suddenly thought of, but she turned her face and said to Kaim with a serious face, Shuheng, I'm telling you, even though Auntie really likes you, young master isn't here right now. You can't take advantage of the situation and have designs on Liangqiu. She scoffed softly, if you dare to try anything funny, I'll tell your Su Qing right now and have her deal with you. That girl is crazy. Back in the day, she had committed many murders and arson. Kaim didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Auntie Sue, how would I dare to have such thoughts? Didn't you say it yourself? Qing dares to commit murder and arson. What's more, after crippling him, he only needed to cut off a small piece of meat. It would only take a few minutes. Aunt Sue was an old woman. She was very straightforward. I saw you and young madam downstairs for 2 nights. Kaim sighed. I can guarantee that nothing will happen. Don't worry, Auntie Sue. Only then did Su Xiu stop thinking about it. It was enough to have his guarantee. Otherwise, even if Su Qing didn't deal with him, she would deal with this brat. Kaim walked Yi Liangqiu all the way to the door. Through the crack of the door, she saw that Yi Liangqiu had fallen asleep, so she said bitterly, Mr. Yi is asleep. It's not convenient for me to go in, so I'll leave first. The doctor said it's not a big deal. Aunt Sue, you should also sleep tonight. Don't be too tired. If there's anything, just call the nurse. Su Xiu nodded. Calling him Mr. Yi is good enough. In the future, just call him that. Calling him Liangqiu is too intimate. Kaim was speechless. He lightly coughed. Aunt Sue, you should keep an eye on Du Yuexing. He has liked Mr. Yi for a long time. Moreover, he was entrusted by President Qin. Naturally, he's different. Su Xiu lightly snorted. That Mr. Du is not bad, but he's already in his 40s. He's older than Liangqiu by 10 years. Impossible. How optimistic. Keim smiled. Without saying anything, he left first. Chapter 18:18. Only then did Su Xiu push the door open and enter. When she saw Yi Liangqiu sleeping, her heart ached. This child had cried again. She had been crying secretly these few days. She was pregnant, so she couldn't cry like this. She would hurt her eyes. She had to talk to her tomorrow. Su Xiu was old. She was extremely sleepy at this time, but she was worried. How could she sleep? She tossed and turned on the small bed for a while. Then, she got up and wanted to walk around the corridor. She put on her clothes, opened the door, and walked around twice. She muttered, "I'm old, I'm useless." If young master was still around, when he came back and the child was 4 or 5 years old, she would buy a house in the countryside and visit occasionally. She knew very well that Liangqiu brought her everywhere. It wasn't that she needed her to take care of the child. In fact, it was Liangqiu who was taking care of her. This child was really kind. She didn't know why she was blinded in the past and didn't believe in her. Fortunately, young master had always believed in her. Fortunately, young master was still alive. That was great. Su Xiu walked around outside. It was cold at night and her old bones couldn't take it anymore, so she came back. She gathered her coat and walked to the elevator. Then, she saw a black figure standing at the door of Liangqiu's ward. Looking at that figure, it looked like Anlin. Su Xiu didn't dare to make a noise and walked over quietly. Her light footsteps must have startled that person. He turned around slowly. Facing the light, she could see everything on his face clearly. Half of it was good, the other half was ruined. At that moment, Su Xiu was speechless. Her body was like a wooden stake that was nailed there. Her face was pale and the corner of her mouth was trembling. She couldn't say a word for a long time. Their eyes met. She was shocked, but there was pain and hurt in his eyes. There was no way to avoid it, and there was no need to. Qin Anlin said, "Aunt Shu." Tears flowed down Aunt Shu's face. She cried hoarsely and then covered her eyes with her thin fingers. Her crying was repressed and tragic. "You bad boy. You actually pretended to be dead to scare Auntie Sue. Do you know how many tears Auntie Sue shed when you left?" Her eyes were about to go blind. At that time, I thought, how can I face the old lady? You are the old lady's only child. But I also know that if I stop you and don't let you go, you won't be happy in this life. Su Xiu had been repressed for too long. When Qin Anlin came over to hug her, she desperately hit his shoulder. Bad boy, you scared Aunt Sue to death." She hit him a little bit because the injuries on his body had not completely healed. But he endured it, because he knew that she was afraid. It was like a tightly wound string that suddenly loosened. She needed to vent. He was suffering, and his heart was just as miserable as hers. After crying for a while, Qingxiu held his face, her heart aching. "Why don't you go home? Liangqiu and the children are waiting for you. She already knew that you were alive. I also heard her secretly telling Mu Yun. Auntie Sue, look at me now. Can I still go back?" Qin Anlin laughed bitterly. "Also, Liangqiu said it on purpose for you to hear. She wants you to live well and not be too sad. Am I not sad now?" Qingxiu's heart ached. She wanted to say go home, but looking at his face and the extended wound on his neck, she hesitated. Chapter 18-19. Qin Anlin looked at Soft Sleeve with a slightly bitter gaze. He put his hands in his pockets and looked at the night sky outside the window. Aunt Sue, rest early. I'll be fine outside. With that said, he gently placed his palm on Soft Sleeve's shoulder and smiled bitterly. Don't worry. Soft Sleeve's tears streamed down. How can I not worry? How can you be alone now? Her heart ached. She wanted to take a good look at his injury, but she was afraid that he would take it to heart. She was really anxious and didn't know what to do. Her heart ached terribly. Aunt Sue, I'm leaving. Qin Anlin smiled lightly. Soft Sleeve looked at his side profile. It was so perfect. Her heart ached terribly. Her young master used to be so perfect. Her fingers touched his handsome face. Her voice was a little shaky. Anlin, don't you want Liangqiu anymore? Her fingers had a faint warmth as they pressed against his face. It had been so many days. He told himself that he had to live. He told himself that Liangqiu was waiting for him. He had been persevering, but there were also times when he was weak. When he supported his weak body to get out of bed, he walked to the mirror and gently removed the gauze. That devil-like face still shocked him. That face, even he was afraid to look at it, not to mention others. His body was also badly damaged and tattered. He was like a monster with half of his body. That day, he supported himself with both hands in front of the sink and let out a strange and miserable laugh. He cried like a child. He forced himself to give up Liangqiu. That kind of pain was even more painful than the pain in his body. And now, this kind of pain was comforted gently because of Soft Sleeve. At this moment, he was like a child. He couldn't bear to leave, couldn't bear to give up. Anlin, how can Aunt Sue bear to leave you alone? Soft Sleeve put her face on his shoulder and cried sadly. She was sad, but Qin Anlin was even sadder. The clothes on his shoulder were soaked and it was hot and wet. It was a little itchy at the wound. He let her cry for a while before patting her back and said in a hoarse voice, Aunt Sue, I'm leaving first. Qingxiu hugged him tightly and refused to let go. His voice was gentle, as if he was coaxing a little girl. Aunt Sue, I'm really leaving. I'll come and see you when I'm free. After that, his fingers gently pried open Su Xiu's hand. He smiled and finally left. Crispy Sleeve stood there in a daze for a long time. Her tears dried up, but she still couldn't make him stay. His wound was actually a wound in his heart. Crisp Sleeve pushed the door open, but she was shocked. The light inside the door was on, and Yi Liangqiu was leaning against the headboard of the bed, her expression a little startled. After a moment of silence, Soft Sleeve walked over and comforted him. Why aren't you sleeping yet? How's the child? Is he still making a fuss? Yi Liangqiu looked up at her and said softly, Aunt Sue, you saw him, didn't you? Originally, Crisp Xiu didn't want to say it, but looking at the tears in the corner of her eyes, her heart couldn't steel itself. She nodded. Yes, I saw it. Young master is pretty good. Pretty good. Then why didn't he come back? Yi Liangqiu was still looking straight at Crisp Xiu. Crisp Xiu sighed and went over to sit beside her. Her skinny fingers gently stroked her long hair. Young master hasn't thought it through yet. He will come back. You have to believe Aunt Sue. He just needs time. Chapter 18-20. However, she was also a woman, and she needed him too. She was pregnant, and when she was vomiting and the baby kicked her, she missed him very, very much. Su Xiu's heart ached, and she kept coaxing her, Liangqiu is very good. If Anlin doesn't come back, Aunt Sue will beat him for you. She turned her face to the side and smiled with tears in her eyes. Is he good? She asked Su Xiao softly in the dead of the night. Su Xiao paused and forced a smile. He's just a little ugly, but everything else is good. He's healthy, and he's alive and kicking. Yi Liangqiu rubbed her face and said, that's good. As long as he was alive, she believed that he would come back one day. She stayed in the hospital and waited for the delivery. He didn't appear again. 1 day, 2 days, 1 week, 2 weeks. She went from being calm to not being calm anymore. She often looked for Keim, but no matter how much she threatened or tempted him, Keim didn't know where he was. Yi Liangqiu couldn't sleep at night because she was worried about him. Don't worry, Mr. Yi. President Qin took away $1 million last time. I think he went to invest. Keim wasn't too worried because President Qin was an expert in stocks when he was studying abroad. If he was given $1 million, he could make 10 times that amount in a year. Yi Liangqiu's belly was very big, and it was difficult for her to get up. She forced a smile. I hope so. However, she thought of that night when Anlin was wearing a hat. Did he care about his appearance? She didn't care if he came back to see her every day. What she cared about was whether he was in pain. Peace was no longer enough for her. She was afraid that he would suffer. She wanted to say it, but she was afraid of hurting him. However, there was only one chance to get close to him. She had let it go, and now there was no more. Anxiety, coupled with the twins, at 9 months, the children were coming out early. Keim carried her to the car and went to the hospital. Su Xiao followed them, and Linda took care of the children. The things that came with him were already prepared, so there wasn't too much chaos. It was just that it was very painful. The heart-wrenching pain, and the incandescent light above the delivery room, drenched in sweat, the pain was intense, and she could vaguely hear the doctor cheering her on, as well as the soft sounds outside. She bit her lips and endured the pain. Time seemed to have returned to that day. She clearly heard him say, "Live well." He said that she was his wife and he could not leave her alone. Anlin, can you hear me calling you? Can you feel my pain? Do you feel our child coming again? Her forehead was drenched in sweat from the excruciating pain. She couldn't give birth to the child for a long time. Her lips were very dry and her body was completely stretched out. She couldn't take it anymore, because of the pain, because she couldn't see him. I almost fainted a few times. My consciousness doesn't seem to be mine. I vaguely hear a furious roar coming from outside. The voice is familiar, yet unfamiliar. Was it Anlin? He's here. She seemed to be suddenly energized again. All she wanted to do was to give birth to the child and see him. She wanted to tell him that she had given birth to 2 more children for him. Anlin would definitely laugh at her for being a pig. The corner of her lips curled up into a vague smile, followed by a wave of tearing pain. She suddenly felt that she had screamed his name. Anlin, a loud and clear cry could be heard. A brand new life had arrived in this world. Not long after, there was another cry. That sound lit up her life. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.